Recognizing the Lord. The sign on the storefront read, "Gone fishing." And with that brief notice, all of the residents in the small town area, we know how small towns are, they all knew that the proprietor, the owner, was out on the lake in his small fishing boat with his 7-year-old grandson. They were two of a kind. They just loved the same thing. They loved getting out together, and they loved the same hobby. And so as they bobbed along in the craft, they pretty much looked like bookends of life, one withered and graying, and the other full of wonder and hope. Both of them wearing their matching D caps and just having the time of their lives out there on the small lake, gone fishing. It sounds like such a wonderful day off, doesn't it? Now, if you are a professional fisherman, for the person who fishes, not for sport or recreation, but for a living, the phrase "gone fishing" is it's kind of the same as going to the office. And for this person, it's not a way to spend idle time or take vacations. The person who fishes for a living is not interested in a stuffed or mounted big mouth bass on the wall of his house, or the tails of trout caught and released in the mountain streams managed by fly fishing clubs. For the professional, it is a matter of full nets to trade into a daily income. Simon Peter was a professional fisherman. So when Peter said to the other disciples, as recorded in our lesson today, "I am going fishing," he was not suggesting a day off of leisure or fellowship. He was suggesting that they return to their old ways of making a living, to return to the way of life they knew before Jesus called them to leave their nets and follow him. It was Peter's way of saying, hey, following Jesus was fine while it lasted, but it's gone. He's gone, and it's high time we all went our separate ways and returned to life as we knew it. As for me, I'm going back to fishing for a living. Basically what he was saying. And with that statement, Simon Peter and the other disciples almost drifted off the pages of history. But as you and I know, given all these years after the early church, all these years that have transpired since something happened to alter Peter's course, what was it? Well, first, Jesus appeared to the disciples, reminding them of their initial call, the initial call to follow him. What a subtle... There's the cat. What a subtle way and a subtle irony Jesus uses to nudge the disciples back awake from their slumber and of their grief. They had once followed him naively and had seen him perform all those wonderful, marvelous signs of God's power. And it seemed to them that he was going to always be with them. But then that terrible dark day outside of Jerusalem happened, and all they had hoped for and believed in perished in that Roman crucifixion. How could they move ahead after that? How does one move ahead after tragedy? But Jesus did not come all the way to earth and suffer and die and rise from the dead only to let the church he wanted to create die in its infancy. Instead of a sermon on this point, Jesus merely suggests the renewed calling to discipleship by staging his appearance in a way that reminded them, took them back in time, to their first encounter with him. Luke's gospel tells the story how on this very same lake, after spending an entire night fishing but catching nothing, Jesus called to them from the shore and bid them to cast their nets over the side of the boats, and suddenly their nets were alive with fish. Now, in our lesson today, the exact sequence occurs. No wonder the disciples cried out, "It is the Lord!" Like a couple rekindling their romance by visiting the restaurant where they first met and started dating, Jesus subtly calls the disciples again in the same way as he did the first time. It is a way of saying, even after Golgotha, nothing about your calling and my presence with you has changed. The invitation and the commission still stands. Follow me. Second, Jesus forgave the disciples, giving them a fresh calling as apostles. The story focuses on Peter, but applies equally to all of the disciples. To move ahead, they not only needed to see past their grief over the death and absence of Jesus, they also needed to see past their own failures. Just as grief can paralyze one's heart, unforgiven sin paralyzes one's sense of the future and usefulness. As a song, I think it's a while ago now, I'm never going to dance again, guilty feet have got no rhythm. That could have been Peter's song. How could he face his Lord? Again, after his miserable failure outside of the high priest's house, where they had taken Jesus for the interrogation prior to his own death. You remember the scene when 3 times Peter denied that he even knew Jesus? The reality is that all of the chosen, all of them left Jesus when they were going through a tough time. The going got tough, and they must have been thinking of now, whoa, we left, and what's he going to say to us? He had every right to be angry with them for running away. He said none of that. Kind of reminds me of, you guys have heard about Bobby before. Bobby's mother was Slovak, and she did not like the fact that on Tuesdays in the school cafeteria, it was Italian Day, and she certainly didn't want her Bobby, because he was the baby in the family, to be corrupted by that kind of food. So every Tuesday, he would come with a lunch the size of a backpack, and he was assigned to my table for years. We always sat together for lunch. But finally, after she knew what the menu was on Tuesdays, every Tuesday she would send him to school with a big lunch that would include something of his ethnicity, along with a couple, not just one, but 2 chocolate cupcakes. And finally, Bobby looked across the table one time and he said, I've got something you're not going to be able to pass up. He says, how about you give me some of that food that you're getting, and I'll trade you, and I'll make sure that you get one of my mom's homemade chocolate cupcakes. Well, my mom didn't raise an idiot, so I was like, yeah, you're right, not passing that one up. And so for years, we were in school right on through, and then all the time on Tuesday, we would make this little exchange. I'd get my chocolate cupcake, he'd get something that she didn't want him to have, but that was okay. But come 5th grade, we were out in the, during recess, and that was when you could pick teams for different things, and we were playing dodgeball. Anyhow, he was captain of one of the teams, and I thought, for sure, he's one of my best friends. He's going to pick me to be on his team. And as everybody was getting picked back and forth, he didn't pick me. I was the last one to be picked, and I was really ticked off, and I let him know. And I remember the harsh words that I spoke to him at that time, and I was like, I can't even believe we're not ever going to be friends again. Well, there were 2 weeks we didn't speak. And finally, another Tuesday came along and we sat down at the table. And all of a sudden, he just pulled out his lunch, opened it up, put a chocolate cupcake right in front of me. And it was as if nothing had ever happened. We didn't talk about it. We didn't express anything. It was just having the meal together and sharing our lunches that all was forgiven. In other words, we kind of broke bread together. And it didn't need words, it just needed the friendship. And we remembered that the friendship was so much more important than being chosen for the dodgeball team. And so we moved forward from that day forward. And yes, he was always a very important part of my life. And so now, with this subtle, probing irony, Jesus gathers Peter around another charcoal fire that he had prepared on the shore. Charcoal fire. It was a charcoal fire outside of the high priest's house, if you remember, when Peter was warming himself, and where he denied Jesus. He denied even knowing him. And 3 times now, Jesus asks Peter, Do you love me? Was it a cruel mockery of Peter's attitude before? A way of rubbing failure into him? No. Jesus was kind of acting like a skillful surgeon of the heart, carefully closing each of the wounds in Peter's story of failure and giving him a threefold chance to profess the love he had no voice to say in the time of the denial earlier. And here is the best part of the story and the proof that Jesus really did forgive Peter and all the rest of the disciples. Because after each of the 3 times that Jesus asked Peter to profess his love for Jesus, he said, "Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep." In other words, Jesus said so much more than the words, "I forgive you." Jesus gave Peter a job. He trusted him again with responsibility, with leadership and the care of the church. And as he said again, the very first words Peter ever heard Jesus say to him, "Follow me." If Jesus can forgive Peter and the rest of the gang for their failures and restore them to great usefulness, both to his fellow men and to God, I think he can do the same thing for us. Hear this word from our risen Lord. He knows all about each and every one of our pasts, and we still have a future with him. He came all the way back from the grave to tell you he still loves you and still has a place of service for you. And maybe like those fishermen so long ago, you will recognize him and hear his voice of forgiveness and commission around the table in a meal that has been prepared especially for you. Come and eat. And the people said, Amen.